How many of you are you expecting to log in?
Um, I think just a few more. I don't know. I'm
Maybe we
happy to
could wait
start.
for another few minutes and then you could start
Okay, okay, ma'am.
because most of the students are there.
Okay.
Yeah. Hi, Prasita, Lakshmi.
Hi, ma'am. Hello, ma'am.
Nice to be online again.
Yeah.
Did you get the notepads? Did you deliver them?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Notepads, pen, pens, or yeah.
Okay, great. And I guess Dr. Kalapi is arriving tonight.
Yes, she said she would be landing around 5:30.
Okay.
So, yeah, so I've informed the security. They'll take her to the hostel room.
Someone would have to look out for Dr. Lauren when she tries to enter. Rima, you there?
Yes, ma'am. I'm there.
Yeah, we just have to look out for Dr. Lauren. Her session is at 6, but she might enter the Zoom room a little earlier.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess we can start if you feel that most of the students have joined.
Yes, ma'am. Sure. I'm very happy to start. Just going to share my screen. One second. Yeah, 1 minute. Is the screen visible, everyone? Just anyone can unmute and let me know.
Yes, Amrita, it is.
It is, right? And I'll just change the slide. Just tell me if the change of slides is also visible. Visible?
Mm, yes,
Okay.
yes.
Right? Okay,
Yeah.
great. Okay, so welcome everyone to our little symposium on African writing. I'm just going to start off with some context and themes. It's a basic overview. So here you see a satellite grab of the African map. Here you see the same map, but you have different writings over it. So let us see what these are. Of course, you have very importantly the 54 countries of the African continent, but you also have in different colors all the European powers that have been here colonially, and the different years in which all these 54 countries got their independence. So some countries in beige, of course, were independent before World War II. It's mentioned here, whereas other countries got independence in different periods. So 1960 is a very important year because around 18 countries got their independence in that year. And post 1960 also, we have many other countries getting their independence. Now, why it's important to look at these countries and their presence in Africa is because different countries in Africa have a variety of ethnicities, each speaking their own language. And colonial residues left behind by these European powers ended up as lingua francas in these countries. So, a lingua franca is a language that serves as a common binding language where a country has many languages, just like English is in India, and English, just like French in different African countries, or Portuguese in Mozambique, ended up being a lingua franca in our country, right? So there is this point of similarity between India and Africa because of our respective colonial legacies. Now, I'm going to look at some essentialist notions of Africa and literature or literary studies around the world. So, since so many students are attending this symposium, it's important to break down what essentialism means over here. So, essentialism is a situation where any concept, community, group, country, identity is reduced to its essence. So, we say that two or three simplistic ideas about Africa are the only ideas about it. So, that is a very reductive understanding of a very diverse continent. And some of these reductive understandings over here have been mentioned. I've just stuck to three very basic ones. So over here, first you see the overemphasis on Western and Southern Africa. Where is North Africa? So I'm just going back to that map. A lot of times when African writing is discussed around the world, these discussions are overfreighted with talks on Nigerian literature or Ghana or South Africa or Kenya, but we ignore Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, and so on and so forth. And it is interesting that a writer like, say, Albert Camus happened to come from Algeria. Although his nationality was French, he was part of different groups, French groups who had gone to Algeria as part of the colonial routine. And these groups were called the Pieds Noirs, black. Sorry, I think I echoed. Well, so you have the Pieds Noirs in Algeria, individuals who were in Algeria for colonial reasons. And then when they came back to France, they were not welcome in French society. So when you look at heritages like these, there are so many points we can have on relationships between the metropole or the core or the locus of colonial power, say in this case France, and then the colonial outpost, Algeria, and what kind of mixed identities formed because of colonization in the continent and beyond. But then a lot of this kind of material is not unearthed because discussions around Africa in literature revolve around just the western and southern parts of the continent. Then the second point where we have essentialist notions of Africa include ideas on Africa's alterity. Now, alterity is also jargon we need to break down here. Alterity is otherness, and Africa is shown as a site steeped in this kind of otherness, in that a lot of its people are shown as primitive or tribal. Madhu Krishnan, who is a scholar in African writing, summarizes this by saying that Africans are framed as the primitive and tribal foils against which Europe could feel its superiority. Sorry, she was talking about the continent, right? So, to give you a quick example here, when I was doing a little research on some South African films and representations of Black female domestic workers in them, I found that a lot of these films make these Black domestic workers look like people who are always engaging in dark arts and practices that to the white settler are quite unsettling and reminders of how true Pan-African culture is outside the bounds of their superior ideas of civilization. Similarly, you have the marketing of Africa as an exotic place, and images of death, disease, poverty. They are sold to the global north for consumption. It's a sort of spectacle for the global north. I'm just going to take you to an extract by Binyavanga Wainaina, which summarizes all these ideas in just one paragraph. So he wrote a very interesting text, How to Write About Africa, a long essay in 2005. And he writes, among your characters, so he's talking about individuals who represent Africa in journalism, in cultural forms like film, and of course literature. So he says, among your characters, you must always include the starving African who wanders the refugee camp nearly naked and waits for the benevolence of the West. Her children have flies on their eyelids and pot bellies, and her breasts are flat and empty. She must look utterly helpless. She can have no past, no history. Such diversions ruin the dramatic moment. Moons are dead. She must never say anything about herself in the dialogue except to speak of her unspeakable suffering. Also, be sure to include a warm and motherly woman who has a rolling laugh and who is concerned for your well being. just call her Mama. Her children are all delinquent. These characters should buzz around your main hero, making him look good. Your hero can teach them, bathe them, feed them. He carries lots of babies and has seen death. Your hero is you, if reportage, or a beautiful, tragic, international celebrity or aristocrat who now cares for animals, if fiction. So, as you can see, this paragraph brings out all the stereotypical tropes and imagery you see in a lot of writing by outsiders on Africa, right? Wherein activists or European entrants or white settlers or individuals, caring individuals who have come to Africa are shown as individuals who've come there to dispense of some civilization, right? And over here, you have a reference. I'll explain that reference. She must never say anything about herself in the dialogue, except to speak of her unspeakable suffering. So, unspeakable, clearly a reference to Joseph Conrad, because Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, which was inspired by a real journey Conrad had in the Isles of Congo as part of a Belgian trading company. And he wrote this text on the people he witnessed there. And very often he speaks of Coots engaging in unspeakable rites in the place, right? And this unspeakable, this one adjective kept giving the text a very mysterious and dark quality, as if a lot of forbidden activity was going on in the island there, because Coots was surrounded by these so-called savage black people, right? And so he's making that reference here to Conrad, and exposing how different kinds of writers have used Africa as a site for suffering, violence, and forbidden rites. We now come to some themes, right? Some themes that we can observe in African writing around the world, right? That second slide was quite important, in that we learned that so many of the nations in Africa were formed in the second half of the 20th century, and with new nations came new nationhoods, how each nation sought to express itself. And here you see post-colonial and post-colonial issues. Clearly, there is a difference between post-colonial with that hyphen and post-colonial without a hyphen. I'm just explaining this for the students. Post-colonial, the first one, of course, refers to the period that we understand as the time after the colony has been independent, right? So after colonization, and therefore post-independence is what is meant here. And post-colonial, the latter refers to complications that have followed after colonial rule in these sites, these outposts, right? So different novels and writings from Africa explore the theme of new nationhood. You have, for instance, Man of the People. Chinua Achebe really inaugurated the genre, I think, with Things Fall Apart and Man of the People, and so on and so forth, right? Sometimes this idea of the new nation is allegorical, sometimes it is explicit and realistic. So social realism is a much used genre in African writing. Similarly, another important theme in African writing is the politics of language, right? And Ngugi's decolonizing rhetoric is the most popular in this regard. But a lot of work was done in this field with regard to Anglophone versus vernacular Africa. So Anglophone Africa, just like Anglophone India, emerged because of the spread of English language education in the continent. Anglophone over here means English speaking, whereas vernacular, is the use of regional or local languages, right? So soon after these countries gained their independence, there were different middle class families pooling in their resources and sending their children abroad to gain an education. And a lot of these Anglophone young people gained more education, and when they came back to Africa, they were called the know all been tos, individuals who always claimed that they had been to the UK or been to the US, and so on and so forth. So the been tos, right, who projected themselves as reformist young people, were always in literature we always find a clash with the conservative old and collectivistic folks of Africa, right? Different nations in Africa. Similarly, there are debates on global versus local literary production. I'm just going to come to that. Madhu Krishnan made a very important point on it. So, in the introduction to her book, Contemporary African Literature in English, Krishnan notes how she's making list of African writers who actually don't live in Africa. So she writes, Abani resides in Los Angeles, Chikwawa in London. Adichie and Angaremba both spend much of their time in Europe and North America. Vera resided in Canada for much of her adulthood, and at the time of her death, Ngugi lives and works in California, and Farah in Cape Town, which, while in Africa, remains remote from his native Somalia. How does this geographic dissonance impact upon the image of Africa circulated in each author's work? Why has this decidedly migratory African identity become representative of African literature writ large? And then she compares these works with fellow contemporary works which have not found a similar international audience. And for instance, you have here, she cited Valerie Tagvira's The Uncertainty of Hope, G.A. Agambila's Journey, Francis B. Nyamjo's The Disillusioned African, all published by independent continental African presses. So she makes a very important point on this kind of geographical dissonance, where you have global African literary production, where you have Africans going to these loci of power, the UK and the US, and publishing from there, versus local literary production, Africans writing in vernacular tongues, publishing with local publishers, and the different kinds of reception that these sets of writers get, right? Proceeding on to the third theme here, the actual and imagined Africa. So, what happened when several middle class folks sent their young African students to foreign countries is they brought back partners. They also brought back not only foreign partners but African American partners. This is a theme that has been explored in a text by Amma Ataidu, The Dilemma of a Ghost. So, African American identity and African identity, the distinction between two, is also something that has been explored in African writing, and how African Americans have a concept of Africa in their imagination, and how that comes into contact with, dialogue with, or even conflict with the actual Africa. So, The Dilemma of a Ghost is a really nice representative text in this case. When we look at the idea of the actual and imagined Africa. And the imagined Africa is again the exotic, sensationalized Africa, also seen as a site for purity for the African American, a site for the African American to purge themselves of their Americanness and turn fully African. But of course, that comes with its own horrors and problematic imaginings, right? Now we come to the last point over here, plurality, explored both thematically and aesthetically. So I spoke of how initially in that first slide, in the slide where we had different African countries and their independence dates, each African country having different ethnicities and languages. Now many African plays often make use of pidgin or different local languages and weld it with the English language or other dominant languages to create a mixed language. And this language lends a sonority to the way dialogue is written in, say, African drama, or it makes language have the cadences of local African life, even though it is predominantly English. So this kind of diversity of Africa, its plurality, multiplicity, is mapped onto the literary text. So you have plurality in themes where different ethnicities are represented, as well as in terms of aesthetics, in the way language or descriptions are used in these literary works. So, a very nice example in that regard would be Ola Rotimi's works, Hopes of the Living Dead, is a very interesting play, in that this text features so many different languages and communities of Africa in one play, even though English is used as some kind of lingua franca. Now, I have this slide on purpose: Indian and African contexts, possibilities of comparison. On any symposium, in any symposium on African writing, it is impossible to not, talk about the similarities between our, contexts, the Indian context and the African context. India has very many similarities with different African countries. Every time I keep mentioning the heterogeneity, the multiple languages, I can also think of the multiple languages used in India. Okay, so the first point of similarity here is, of course, the gift and challenge of ethnic diversity. Because ethnic diversity can be channeled in so many ways, but it's also difficult to manage. And how does that manifest textually, from a literary point of view? That is one question to explore. Then the complex relations natives share with the English language, again something Angugi had explored. You have Indians who both love and resent English, and English cannot be avoided, however, because English has immense utility as a binding language, and English is also the language of trade and commerce. But does that to an extent alienate the ordinary average Indian from their uh, ethnicity or their original culture? That is a question, right? And that dialogue always comes up. The same kind of discourse you can see in African contexts. Then the tussle between development discourse and traditional value systems, right? The building of dams, buildings, the invasive nature of technology and urbanization. But what does that do to the rural Indian or the rural African, the provincial people of these countries? How do they respond to these kind of changes, and what kind of conflicts end up because of this kind of development discourse that reimagines a country without its poor, its rural population, and its vulnerable people, right? So these are some points of comparison. Of course, there are more contexts, themes, and points of comparison within this corpus of writing called African writing. And so I am just looking forward to the rest of the symposium and hearing the other speakers and what kind of themes, contexts, and points of comparisons they might bring up. I have just included in this last slide a sort of conclusion, presenting some African writers at Xavier's. We have Aikwe Arma, Amata Aidu, Chinua Achebe, all writers we have taught across our compulsory and non-compulsory courses. And of course, we hope to, at some point, engage with more African writers. So with this, I am going to conclude my opening gambit, my opening presentation to this symposium. And I look forward to the rest of the speakers. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you, Amrita. So maybe I can take over from here. I just like to introduce myself. I'm Dr. Mala Parvrang. I'm the principal of BMN College. And it's really a privilege to be able to do this symposia jointly with the department. In fact, I am thankful to Amrita because she has kind of more or less covered a lot of things that I had planned to say in my historical overview of African writing. And since Amrita has so competently already touched upon many of these points, what I would be saying would be a kind of reinforcement of several of the points that she has discussed. I've titled my talk as the early years of African writing from Chinua Achebe to Adichie, 6 decades of storytelling, because I feel it is very important for whoever is looking at African literature to get a sense of the socio-historical background. It's like when we study or traditionally we would study British literature or Indian literature, we always look at the chronological trajectory of how that literature has developed over time. As Amruta has rightly pointed out, we have to keep in mind that when we say African writing, it does not refer to a homogeneous identity. And there is a tendency that we often talk about an African literature paper or an African writing paper. And therefore, we've called this symposium as writing from the African continent, rather than African writing per se, because as Amrita has pointed out, it covers a vast and complex body of creative writing. The European languages, because of the colonial influence, and also the oral traditions or indigenous languages, and the writing of the oral traditions, which is referred to as orature. It's important when we look at the thematic concerns of the early decades of African writing to understand that the fiction and the other genres from the African continent have emerged from the colonial encounter. And this has basically been the preoccupation of writers reacting to the intense historical experience of colonization, decolonization, and neocolonization. And when you look at the growth of the writing, the trajectory of the writing, you can easily look at African writing from these three phases of colonization, decolonization, and neocolonization. If you take African and Black literature as a whole, and this is a comment by the Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o, he rightly points out that it is one body of 20th century literature that can be truly associated with questions of the right to be, the fundamental right to be, economic and political environment around the right to be, the quality of that being. And African writers have raised their voice through time against slavery, colonialism, and today against African-run post-colonial regimes. So basically, the writing that has emerged from the continent has been political. And in many ways, it has been post-colonial in the sense that it is a political act of reclaiming one's denied identity. Amrita has also pointed this out, that when we look at post-colonial literature, we are not looking at something that has chronologically come after independence, but the post, that is the interaction between the imperial culture and the complex of indigenous cultural practices. And in the early years of African writing, some writers have been pointed out to you, and I'm happy that they are part of your syllabus. At least the first 3 or 4 decades of writing, if you take Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart as a benchmark, basically it's writing and reading practices that are a consequence of Europe's expansion and exploitation of the other world. If you are looking at colonization as a huge project which worked in terms of capturing minds and imaginations through a master discourse that came from Europe or from Britain, therefore the post-colonial movement becomes a massive intellectual, moral, and imaginative overhaul and deconstruction of the West's representation of the non-Western world. And I think nothing illustrates this better than the writing that has emerged from the African continent. In 1884, in the 1884 to 85 Berlin Conference, which was a series of meetings held between the European imperial powers of Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Belgium, Portugal, and Spain, there was a scramble to carve out parts of Africa amongst themselves. And this is commonly referred to as the scramble for Africa. And you can see the Africa map behind, which is represented as a big cake. And this cake was sliced up so that by the 19th century, and this map has been shown to you by Amrita, almost the entire African continent was again under European rule. And if you're doing post-colonial writing, one does look at Frantz Fanon, and one has to look at Frantz Fanon, and he makes a very important point that it was impossible for European countries to physically control such a vast continent. Just look at the size of Africa and the size of Europe. And therefore, control had to be sustained through a series of ideological mechanisms. And this whole complex of ideological machinery ensured the cultural and psychological subordination. And one of the most effective tools of colonial hegemonic control was the negation of identity through the denial of a collective history. And what this meant was that the African past was written out of history in the rewriting of the Western master narrative of colonial history. There was no space for what happened in Africa before the colonizers arrived. And the absence of a written tradition, where there was no written script within the African cultures, made it all the more easier for the imposition of the colonizers' language through the mechanisms of education in English. And these are the kind of pillars of colonization which the writers tried to take and tried to decolonize through their writing. And Ngugi mentions this in Petals of Blood. He talks about the complicity of religion, language, and education over the dissemination of knowledge. And I quote from his novel, "The missionary carried the Bible, the soldier carried the gun, the administrator and the settler carried the coin, Christ, commerce, civilization, the Bible, the coin, the gun." And since you have read up Chinua Achebe, and it was mentioned that this is part of your syllabus, I think this is a very important quotation that is oft cited, where Achebe, at the first Conference of Commonwealth Literature held in 1964, talks about the powerful role that literature can play to help a society regain its belief in itself and put away complexes of the years of denigration and self-denigration. And he says that he views this as the role of the writer, the role of the novelists. And he kind of puts it out very clearly when he says that the role of the novelist is to teach my readers that the past, with all its imperfections, was not one long night of savagery from which the Europeans, acting on God's behalf, delivered them. And Achebe becomes very critical of Enlightenment philosophers, and he also critiques Hegel, for example, in the philosophy of history, where Hegel mentions that Africa enters history only upon contact with Europe after one long night of savagery. Yeah? So the history of the African novel has been essentially a history of an evolving racial consciousness, of a denigration of the Black racial consciousness, and an attempt to recover this consciousness to kind of strategize against what has been referred to as the intellectual hijacking of the African by the Western colonial enterprise. And if you look at the roots of the writing that emerges from the African continent, there was a close relationship between the negritude movement that was happening in the United States in the 1920s. And if you go a little back, the arrival of Edmund Blyden in Liberia in 1851, which was a very crucial stage in the modern African thought. And of course, you had the Black nationalism of Marcus Garvey and the Pan-Africanism of Du Bois, which had a very important role in reasserting the whole philosophy and the assertion of pride in being Black. The negritude movement, which basically took place in French Africa, was signaled by an awakening of race race consciousness by Francophone poets and intellectuals of the 1940s, like Aimé Césaire, David Diop, and Leopold Senghor. Okay? By the time you came to the 1950s, the struggle for independence had picked up in countries across Africa, and you had the cultural nationalist movement, where cultural nationalism, the struggle for nationalism, the struggle for independence went parallel to the idea of reasserting one's roots and one's identity as African, and therefore the whole idea of African writing emerging, which much later on now we talk about Nigerian writing, Kenyan writing, Ghanaian writing. And then therefore in the 50s, you find that literature was mainly marked by anti-colonial indignation and pro-independence nationalist thinking. As Amrita rightly pointed out, many of these writers were educated in missionary schools. They were educated in English, and therefore they had this double-blind situation. They were trying to write in an alien tongue, but trying to capture and reassert their own African sensibility. And perhaps one of the earliest works that emerged, which we really don't look at very closely, unfortunately, is one of the first generation writers from Nigeria, Amos Tutuola. You also had Cyprian Ekwensi, you have Elaichi Amadi, and they worked towards recapturing indigenous African cultural spaces by experimenting with language. And 1953, you have Amos Tutuola's The Palm Wine Drinker, the first Nigerian novel to be published by Faber and Faber, but widely critiqued and kind of run down. Dylan Thomas himself refers to the language as Young English. Tutuola's attempt to incorporate Yoruba myth and folklore, spiritual world of beings, of human beings, was not really accepted by readers in the West. And it took another 5 years, another 4 years, before Chinua Achebe published his landmark novel, which one could consider one of the most brilliant master narratives in post-colonial writing, which is, I'm sure that all of you are familiar with his book, Things Fall Apart. Today, as I mentioned, I don't think that you can really study post-colonial literature without looking at Achebe's Things Fall Apart, because of the manner in which he constructed a significant counter-narrative and a counter-hegemonic resistance, a discourse of resistance to the whole colonial experience. Achebe went on to write other novels, Arrow of God, No Longer at Ease, A Man of the People, and Antilles of the Savannah. But I think that one has to acknowledge, of course, all the other novels are equally brilliant, but one has to acknowledge Things Fall Apart as with a certain generational project and a foundational moment of literary history, and the kind of intervention that it created in the field of African literature. Simon Gikandi points out, and I think this is very true because I too remember this very vividly, like one of the most momentous events one is bound to remember, like where one was when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Many of us recall where we were when we first read Achebe's novel. I'm not going to go into this too much because Amrita has mentioned that Xavier's does teach Things Fall Apart, and I'm sure that others who have logged in from other colleges must be familiar with the background. But I find this is a very important quotation when Achebe asserts that the story of Africa was something that could not be told for us by anyone else, no matter how gifted or well-intentioned. And it was a reaction to a book called Mr. Johnson by Joyce Carey, which had a very kind of stereotyped portrayal of the African, someone who is not intelligent, someone who is servile, someone who tries to ape the European. And this angered Achebe considerably that he gave up medicine and he turned to writing. As you can see, the second quotation, that the Harmattan is as fit a subject to write on as winter. It was a reaction to the predominance of British literature, which was taught in schools and in the universities. And he said that for a child in Nigeria, the winds, the desert winds of the Harmattan makes much more relevance than for the child to be reciting poetry about snowflakes. No, and the similar kind of comment that he made about daffodils, where everybody had to learn William Wordsworth's poem, The Daffodils, and the child would know very little about the Harmattan. If you are familiar when things fall apart, I'm sure that you recollect the ending of the story, where Okonkwo has committed suicide and the local administrator comes down to take his body. And he says that he would like to write a book about this African character, Okonkwo, and what caused him to commit suicide. And then later on, he changes it and he says, it will not be a book, it will maybe a chapter. And then he says, not a chapter, maybe I'll give him a paragraph. And we are told that Okonkwo is finally reduced to a single line in the book by the British administrator. So what Achebe does is he takes such single line, expands it to a paragraph, makes it into a chapter, and then makes it into a book. And he writes back and he reclaims the total history of Igbo land that had been totally marginalized by the colonizers. So there are two things. One is the idea of appropriation, of using Igbo words and proverbs, and therefore he Africanizes the English language. And the second is the idea of abrogation, where the indigenous oral account of Okonkwo will be usurped by the written official account of the white district officer, and how Achebe takes back that account and reinserts it into our consciousness. I'll just walk through the other writers, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who we lost very recently, one of the most remarkable leftist writers, revolutionary writers, who started off by writing novels in the grain of cultural nationalism, Weep Not Child and a Grain of Wheat, and whose famous quote is, until the lion learns how to write, every story will glorify the hunter. And then he went on to write more radical, more leftist, more Marxist writing, such as in Petals of the Blood and in 2006, Wizard of the Crow. Again, you cannot do post-colonial literature and theory unless you're familiar with Decolonizing the Mind, which talks about the politics of language and culture and the role of language in culture if you are going to reclaim the intellectual, the whole arena which has been colonized. And the only way to get back your identity is by decolonizing the same. You have the Nigerian dramatist, novelist, essayist, Wole Soyinka, who was also writing in the 1960s. Apart from his plays, his remarkable plays for which he got the Nobel Prize, he has also written a number of essays, and I think a very important collection in today's times that we need to look at is Soyinka's Climate of Fear and the Quest for Dignity in a Dehumanized World. You have Aikwe Arma, Amrita also mentioned that. Again, although he was writing in the 1960s, where you enter the period of disillusionment, you had the period of cultural nationalism, the first 10 or 12 years after independence, and then disillusionment with the elite and the ruling political class and the corruption that came in. And I think that this text also is extremely relevant in today's context. The beautiful ones are not yet born. Amar went on to write several other novels, including 2000 Seasons and The Healers, where he kind of looks at African history not as the 200 years of colonization, but stretching back 2000 years into the past, reminiscent of what Ganesh Devi writes in After Amnesia, that Indian history was, meaning the British rule in Indian history was a minuscule part of our larger history, which extends back thousands of years. By the time you come to the 1970s, late 1970s and early 1980s, you have writers who become increasingly anti-government, who start protesting against the exploitation at multiple levels. And you have the Nigerian writer of fiction, short stories, political essays, Ken Saro-Wiwa, who paid the price for organized protests against the Anglo-Dutch oil company Shell in the Niger Delta. He was hanged along with other fellow Ogoni activities by the Nigerian government. And those of you who are interested in looking into petrofiction, I think Ken Saro-Wiwa becomes a very important writer. As the critic Garuba puts it, he had the ability to take literature into the streets and the streets into literature. His Detention Diary is an extremely powerful piece of writing. And talking about women writers, where you had a number of prominent women writers who were writing from the 50s up to the present day, Vion Vera and C.C. Dagaremga, writing in the 1990s and early 21st century. I'm not really going to touch on them too much because Dr. Kalapi Sen is talking about women writers tomorrow. Somalia is a very unusual case when you look at the rest of Africa, because Somalia was never really colonized as British and French and Portuguese Africa was. Somalia was occupied for a certain period of time by the Italians, a certain period of time by the British, and was at the brunt of the whole idea of drawing boundaries, redrawing boundaries, redefining territory. And I urge you to look at Nuruddin Farah's maps, where this whole idea of territory, belonging, mapping, remapping, demapping, it's a fascinating, absolutely fascinating novel, and perhaps one of the most complex and difficult of contemporary African works. It's based in the disputed territory of Ogaden, which is at the Horn of Africa. Farah also has another very interesting book, which is 1992 called Gifts, which is in the context of international aid. And he suggests that aid that is given, especially by the West, is done with the intention of prolonging the relationship of dependency and makes us look at the whole politics of giving and receiving, and also look at the context of micronationalism and ethnographic violence. By the time you come to the late 1990s, as I mentioned, African writers are increasingly writing against the government, against the dictatorships that sprung up in the late 1960s and 70s. By 1970s, there were almost 33 coups across Africa. Jack Mpanje from Malawi, another prison writing. You had Ngugi writing from Kenya, detained. You have Shoinka's prison memoirs, as I mentioned, Ken Saro-Wiwa, and you have Jack Mpanje, again, who spent a number of years in prison for writing against the Malawian government. Mpanje describes the voices in this anthology, Gathering Seaworth, as a defiant recasting of Africa's history through the eyes of some of its finest hostages. I think it's a tribute to dissidents who have refused to be erased from memory and made invisible by the autocratic regimes that imprison them. I had the opportunity of meeting Jack Mpange at one of the conferences, and he walked with a limp. And when I inquired about his health, he said that this limp came about because he was made to stand hours at length in ice cold water as one of the punishments in prison, but a remarkable writer and a remarkable person. By the 1990s, you had African writers who moved away from social realism, started to experiment with postmodernism. You have Dambutso Marechera from Zimbabwe, for example, The House of Hunger, Ben Okri's Dangerous Love, Famished Road, Love. You have more and more experimentation moving into magic realism, moving away from straightforward social realistic writers. And finally, we come to Adichie, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, perhaps who is better known nowadays among many people who look at African writer because of the recognition that she has got from Western publishers and the publicity and the book prizes that she has been awarded. As Amrita pointed out, you had Ngugi who was in the USA, you had Mphace who was in UK, you have Farah who is in South Africa, but one has to keep in mind that these writers are outside Africa because they are all been declared as political dissidents. And many of them are either in self-exile or asylum and cannot really return back to Africa. But Adichie, yes, remarkable two books of her early works, Purple Hibiscus and Half of a Yellow Sun, which are based during the Biafran Civil War in Nigeria. But I would like to add with a talk that she had given, a TED talk that Adichie had given, where she talked about, and I'd like to read it in full, where she says, stories matter, many stories matter. Stories have been told to dispossess and to malign. So sorry, I'll just get that back on. But stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity. And she ends the talk, she cites Alice Walker, and she talks about how the story can be a very powerful tool, which I think all the African writers from the early decades have kind of proved to us through the way that they write. And she ends with this thought, and I cite from her again. When we reject the single story, when we realize that it's never a single story in any place, we regain a kind of paradise. And I think that this reminds us that there cannot be a single master narrative. One has to look at multiple stories and recognize the existence of multiple stories. So I will end here. What I've been trying to do is trying to give you a perspective about the early years of African writing in order to set the context for the other talks that would come about now. And I once again thank Xavier's College, and I also thank all the other speakers who will be joining. And I will be there tomorrow also. So I'm really looking forward to interacting with all of you in person. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Am I audible?
Yes, Rashmi, I can hear you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mala ma'am. I've been taking notes, and it's always uh, really a treat to listen to your lectures. And this overview will definitely help our students also clue into the lectures that will be held today and tomorrow. Thank you for this overview. And I don't think our audience really knows Mala ma'am. So I would like to now tell the audience about a little about Mala ma'am. She's a principal and principal of Dr. BMN College. She's a full professor, a passionate researcher, and someone who's researched very intensely on African writing in English, gender studies, and diaspora theory. Ma'am is the postdoctoral fellow of Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, Germany, and has served as its ambassador scientist to India from 2019 to 2024. A Fulbright Scholar, Charles Wallace Research Grant awardee, Dr. Arun Tikekar Fellowship from the Asiatic Society of Mumbai, and many, many awards. Ma'am's PhD, The Changing African Consciousness, a socio-literary study of the novels of Aikwai Arma, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and Eskia Mafale. In fact, this was a very early doctoral dissertation in India to focus entirely on African writings. Her key publications are on African literature, and they include readings from Things Fall Apart and Ngugi's works. She is, in fact, currently the series editor for Postcolonial Lives, published by Brill. And I must also tell, especially the Xavier students, that ma'am is an integral part of our Board of Studies, and this wonderful syllabus that you see has ma'am's stamp on it. In fact, ma'am is the one who has always reminded us that we can't get Eurocentric and we need to look at other literatures, especially African literatures. And in fact, one of the reasons why we have a lot of African writings compared to many other places is thanks to ma'am's intervention, among many other things. And ma'am is also part of our IQAC and has always been part of St. Xavier's College. So thank you so much, ma'am, for this introduction. And we'll continue the session.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rashmi. And you forgot to mention that I've had the privilege of having you as my student.
Yes, I must mention that ma'am was my
Yes.
PhD supervisor and also my teacher at MA. So our association goes over 20 years, I think, more than 20 years. So thank you so much, ma'am. It was
Thank you.
wonderful to be in your class again.
Thank you. I was just wondering whether Dr. Lauren has joined.
Yes, ma'am,
I am
she's here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Welcome, Dr. Lauren.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Shall I share my screen or PowerPoint, or are there
Yeah,
any other formalities first?
No, I'll just introduce you very briefly because I'm sure the
Thank
students
you.
and everybody here, we have almost 53 people who have logged in, and I'm sure they would all like to know a little about you. We're really grateful to Dr. Lauren van der Reed, who is currently a lecturer in the Department of English at the Stellenbosch University, South Africa, for kindly agreeing to be with us this evening. Dr. Lauren is the PI, the primary investigator of the Perforated Memory Research Project. Her research thinks the intersection of genocide and other forms of annihilatory violence, literary, cultural, and memory studies from and through Africa. She's held a position next generation scholar of the DST NRF flagship for critical thought in African humanities at the Center for Humanities Research at the University of the Western Cape, and recently completed her time as an A.W. Mellon BECH Africa Fellow at the University of Ghana. Her work has been published in the Canadian Review of Comparative Literature, Chronos, and the edited volume Mnemonic Solidarity Global Interventions. And with such an impressive resume and a very, very important topic where she's going to look at trauma narratives, we are really looking forward to your presentation, Dr. Lauren.
Thank you so much, Professor. I'm gonna turn on my video just to greet you all. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction and the very warm welcome. I really want to offer my thanks to you, Professor Malapandarang, for the very kind invitation to engage in this important symposium, and of course to my colleague, Professor Nadia Sanger, who unfortunately can't be here today because of other commitments, scholarly commitments. But I'm very grateful for the opportunity to think with you all and also to learn from you as well. Can I go ahead and share the small PowerPoint that I would like to put up?
So you just have to click onto the share icon.
Mhm. Let's see if it will allow me to do this. Okay. I'm going to see if it will pull up the PowerPoint. It's not coming up for some reason.
Rima, can you give Dr. Lawrence sharing rights?
Yes, ma'am, I'm looking at it.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, I'm going to see because I would like to just read the few notes that I've written as I'm going through it. So, of course, I don't want everyone to see the notes, but
Yeah,
just the
Yeah, I
PowerPoint.
think you should be able to do it. You've been made a co-host, so you should be able to do it.
Okay. So can you see that PowerPoint?
Yes, we can.
Okay, and if I pull up the notes, do you see that?
Yes, not the note.
do?
We could see, we can see
Okay.
your slide.
All right, excellent. I'll try to keep track of that. Okay, so I will today very briefly, as it were, try to offer really, it won't be as nearly as comprehensive as the presentation that we've just enjoyed, but rather to offer a few points of entry. So, okay, just confirming again, everybody can see the slide?
We can see it. Could you put it on full screen?
Okay, I can try to do so. Just give me 1 second. Sharing. If for some reason I can't even see the slides now. But okay, let's put it on full screen.
Yes. Now that's
Okay.
great. Yeah, that's great.
Okay. Hopefully this works. Just give me 1 second. Sorry about all the technical problems. Because I do not want to share my screen, but anyway. Yeah, it's not gonna allow me to do that, I don't think.
Well, that's okay. You can just continue. We can look at, we can
All
make
right.
a slide.
Okay. Okay, apologies for that. So really what I'm offering here is something of a brief survey, as it were. And so I want to ask or to offer a few guiding and framing questions with regards to what it is I hope to open up with you all as we work towards having a conversation about this together. And so what does it mean to think from Africa as not merely a geographical place, but a concept and a method for reading problems of lived experience, such as historical trauma? How do African writers respond to, stage, and represent the lived experience of historical trauma in a way that abides by African approaches to justice, history, and repair? These are questions I hope will guide our conversation today as I attempt to traverse with you Africa as an intellectual locale focalized through examples of trauma narratives. So the history of African traditions of storing lived experience is long and dynamic, as we've just heard. And it includes oral traditions, visual representations, performance, and indeed the written word as modes of storing both what it means to be African in the world, but also what it means to perceive the world from Africa. Because African literature is long in its history and dynamic in its presentation, I cannot make a claim to offer any robust or complete discussion of this important field of critical thought and imagining. Instead, what I offer today are just a few points of entry into this vast, complex, and constantly developing field we call African literature, focalized by the prism of African examples of historical trauma, such as colonialism, genocide, and apartheid. This talk, which is limited to the recent history of colonial and post-colonial literary interventions written by African authors, focuses on African examples of storing this trauma from locales such as Ethiopia, Rwanda, and South Africa, but also from imagined and unnamed spaces. So I'm going to try and go to the next slide. This is reflected in the works of authors such as Chinua Achebe and Wole Soyinka, who write back and against colonial discourses on Africa, and more recent examples such as the work of Uwem Akpan and Beata Umubuyeni Marise, which is concerned with the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda circa 1994, and Jolyn Phillips and C.A. David's work, which is concerned with the post-apartheid condition and the legacies of apartheid, which are still felt in South Africa. Together, these networked examples of text invite us to read these trauma narratives also as reflections of resilience. These texts, along with several others I will mention, open up key movements within African literature that work to problematize colonial discourses and structures, right back against the false colonial construction of Africa as backwards, underdeveloped, dangerous, and inherently violent, and highlights resilience by staging African concepts such as Ubuntu, which is the South African word for this continentally shared belief that our humanity stems from our ability to recognize the humanities in others. Kwibuka, a Kenya-Rwandan word for the call to remember our shared, or be they traumatic histories, used specifically in relation to the genocide which unfolded in Rwanda through 1994, and Sankofa, a Twi word from the Akan people of Ghana, imploring us to learn from the past as we move toward a new, perhaps different future. But what is an African literature? As Achebe, as we've just heard explains in his 1975 collection of essays, Mourning Yet on Creation Day, and particularly in the essay, The African Writer and the English Language, that you cannot cram African literature into a small, neat definition. African literature, he argues, cannot be viewed as one unit, but as a group of associated units. In fact, the sum total of all the national and ethnic literatures of Africa, end quote, which may or may not be written in English, depending on any author's response to the question of whether or not they should be writing in English. But for our purposes, we will consider text written in English as a medium of communication rather than instruction, and take our cue from Achebe in thinking also trauma narratives as resisting neat definitions, and indeed as resisting the view that they can be grouped into one unit, but rather should be thought of as, a dynamic group of associated units. So Achebe demonstrates his argument in his own work, including perhaps his most famous work, Things Fall Apart, as we've just heard. And there are several powerful and nuanced themes in the novel, including questions of indigenous knowledge and power structures, intercultural knowledge, but also contradiction, African masculinities, and it is particularly critical of the veil of colonial domination and subjugation, masked as a civilizing mission, which discursively produces Africans as heathens needing to be saved, a problematic stereotype which was used to justify not only colonial conquest, but colonial erasure of African civilizations and even peoples. Frantz Fanon, of course, reminds us that colonialism is a kind of genocide. He refers to it as a bloodless genocide. And Achebe's work, which is at the heart of, which has been at the heart of the work of important thinkers across generations, including Fanon, and as we've just heard, Professor Dr. Mala Pandurang, who we have had the pleasure of listening to, and is regarded Achebe as a landmark body of work for an entire generation of authors and thinkers who sought to and seek to offer an intellectual and creative critique of colonialism and its discourse from and through Africa, which include another Nigerian literary great such as Wole Soyinka, but also literary giants such as feminist writer Ama Ata Aido, whose works include the play The Dilemma of the Ghost, the novels Our Sister Killjoy, and Changes, a Love Story. And also post-colonial Ghanaian poet Kofi Anido, who has authored 5 collections of poetry: Elegy for the Revolution, A Harvest of Our Dreams, Earthchild, Ancestral Logic and Caribbean Blues, and Praise Song for the Land, as well as Egyptian feminist writer and activist Nawal al-Sawadi, whose works include the collection of short stories entitled I Learned Love, a personal memoir, Memoir from the Women's Prison, and the famous novel God Dies by the Nile. Other less renowned authors include Ethiopian poet, writer, and activist Amatuma, whose work I want to stay with a little bit. So of course, Ethiopia was never subject to any formal European colonial settlement beyond the 2-year Italian occupation of the 1940s. But Tuma's work highlights the ways in which even African states that were never colonized could not escape the ideological reach and force of colonization, of European colonization as conquest. He does this by criticizing in his literary works not only the Selassie imperial regime in Ethiopia, but the military regime of the Derg, which ruled after Emperor Selassie's deposition from 1974 until 1991. And when, during this ruling governmental structure, this military junta was eventually dismantled, again in 1991. His works include the short story 10 on the Terror Scale, which is published in the anthology of short stories titled The Socialist Witch Doctor and Other Stories, and the poem Just a Nobody, although there are several other examples we can think with, which move beyond mere critique toward a decolonial gesture through the use of literary devices such as satire, surrealism, and the deployment of African folklore to critique the state terror which Ethiopians were subjected to over those nearly 30 years, and in particular the period referred to as the Red Terror. So this period officially is recognized as unfolding between 1976 through to 1978. And Tuma's work offers us an interesting approach, I think, to the way in which an African author is storying the lived experience of what is referred to as a historical trauma, because what he highlights is the many ways in which, the real actually surpassed the imagined. And particularly his use of satire is a good example of this. And what his work also demonstrates is the way in which our conceptions of trauma has been and continues to evolve. And he pays particular attention to the very kind of ordinary, banal, quotidian expressions of trauma in his literary works. And so he's writing in the moment of the Derg's regime, but also in the moment of its dismantlement. And he writes both in English, but also in Amharic. And it's really in the 1990s where his work begins to gain, I think, kind of international traction. And of course, the 1990s is a turning point for various African nations, and in turn, African literature or literatures too, having moved through the decolonial turn of the likes of Achebe, Soyinka, and Ame Césaire, but also later Tuma and Richard Reeves, for example, of South Africa, to the beginning of the new century with Nnedi Okorafor, Sylvia Tamale, and Jolyn Phillips, along with many, many others who mark this turn, both in colonial consciousness, but also in African literature's response to what it means to live with the conditions that these various locales and authors are engaging with. So the 1990s saw many crucial moments in our shared history, but I'll limit my focus today, given the focus on trauma narratives, to the genocide which targeted the Tutsi in Rwanda and the dismantling of the apartheid state in South Africa, as both of these events took place in 1994, that I think continue to garner scholarly attention, but also the attention of literary authors and thinkers. So just over 3 decades ago, the world watched as thousands of military personnel, militias, and civilians bore arms and killed hundreds of thousands of their countrymen, neighbors, and family in what was an attempt to, and I quote, rid, end quote, Rwanda of the Tutsi minority by the Hutu power extremist regime. The violence of 1994, however, was recognized legally as genocide only toward the end of the now infamous 100 days of its peak. A symptom of this is that, as Mahmoud Mamdani asserts, Rwanda is recalled as a time when we thought we needed to know more. We waited to find out, to learn the difference between Hutu and Tutsi and why one was killing the other, but it was too late, end quote. And this is taken from his work, Saviors and Survivors. The official record states that between the 7th of April 1994 and the 15th of June of the same year, approximately 800,000 to 1 million people were killed in a deliberate attempt to annihilate the Tutsi people of Rwanda. The first instance of the use of genocide as a legal concept for indictment, what is popularly referred to as the Rwandan genocide, has been the subject of much scholarship and much literary work, including films such as Raoul Peck's Sometimes in April, and of course, George Takei's Hotel Rwanda, but also novels such as Beata Umebie Marise's recent work, All Your Children Scattered, and Clementine Wamaria's memoir, The Girl Who Smiled Beads, as well as Uwem Akpan's short story, My Parents' Bedroom. Together, these works etch deeply personal accounts of this genocide as a historical trauma that is intergenerational and affects entire populations. The work of Rwandan scholars such as Claver Irakose make this clear. However, these also sound a call, kwibuka, remember. This is an instruction staged by these literary works as trauma narratives that insist both on reckoning with the shared traumatic past, but also in many ways on highlighting the potential of the human spirit for resilience. One such example can be taken from Uwem Akpan's My Parents' Bedroom, in that it is focalized by its young protagonist, Monique, who is a girl child, and who we learn as we follow the story, really sees the intimacy, to borrow Mamdani's term, of this genocide, where the perpetrators who are committing these acts, who are etching the trauma, are known to her in often intimate ways. I mean, in the story, we learn that one such person, is an uncle, another such person is a neighbor. But we also see that this child does not let go of her faith and does not let go really of her resilience, her hope to continue to survive along with her brother, despite, as we will see towards the end of the text, the death of her parents. And so it is difficult, however, for me as a South African, despite my scholarly expertise and investment in the question of genocide thought from and through Africa, to think of Rwanda and the genocide and not also think of South Africa and the fall of apartheid as a regime which seeped into every facet of South African, but also in the lives of the people of its colony, such as Namibia, for example, but also surrounding states' lives. In the same month as the genocide against the Tutsi began, South Africans were participating in what was the first free and openly democratic election. This election was held on the 27th of April, 1994, and it is a day we still commemorate. Apartheid may be understood as the legislated and institutionalized system of subjugation of the majority of the Black population of South Africa. And here I use Black in the sense that Steve Biko does, capital B, to signal, subjugated peoples, as opposed to abiding by apartheid's kind of stratification of race, in which all peoples who were deemed non-white by the National Party regime were stratified into the racial groups Black or African, colored, Indian, and Asian, and which hierarchically ordered South African society using these racial designations, with white people being framed as the superior race and Black people being framed as the most inferior. An echo of the old colonial discourse against which generations of African creatives and authors have been resisting through their writing. Several authors have taken both apartheid and the post-apartheid condition as the subjects of their work, including Richard Jeeves, who in his novels Emergency and Emergency Continued used the relationship of a father and son to demonstrate both the tyranny of the apartheid regime, particularly during states of emergency, and the fracturing effect it had on families, especially between different generations. Similarly, Ankie Krogh, Andre P. Brunk, and Breyten Breitenbach, to name but a few, who were white South Africans, used their writing as activism to both oppose the state, but also to activate a kind of consciousness within their readership with regards to the cost of privilege. As Black consciousness titan Steve Biko explains in I Write What I Like, racialized privilege is the product of racialized subjugation. This call to consciousness is further echoed in the works of contemporary scholars such as author, stage performer, and songwriter Jolyn Phillips, whose work Ching Chang Cherries and Other Stories describes the little-known and often ignored world of the small coastal town of Gansbaai's fishing community here in the Western Cape, and reflects the natural disorder of daily life and explores how the impact of love and loss defines and divides families and communities, particularly as these echo the logic of apartheid. What Phillips' work, along with the creative works of the likes of C.A. Davids, for example, including a recent novel, How to Be a Revolutionary, or Barbara Boswell's The Comrade's Wife, point to, is an insistence on resilience. This echoes the core themes of resilience as Ubuntu, Kwibuka, and Sankofa that emerge in the works I have cited in this brief talk today. These stories of trauma and both the spectacular and the often banal quality of the overwhelming violence that has been experienced on this continent as a locale in the form of colonialism, apartheid, and even genocide offer us something of a method from Africa in writing trauma, as also reflective of the human spirit of resilience. We see this also in the now swell of literary texts concerned with the Namibian experience of genocide. And genocide in the context of colonial onslaught. An example that swirls an insistence on Ubuntu, again recognizing the humanity of the victims of this violence, which they were refused by the German colonial machine. Kwibuka, an insistence on remembering what has often been referred to as the forgotten genocide. And Sankofa, looking back in order to make thinkable the state of the present and imagine a future beyond the intergenerational effects of this kind of trauma. Some examples include The Scattering by Laurie Kabutsile and Mama Namibia by Maria Serebrov, but also the work of scholars such as Nelson Mlambo and emerging scholars such as Evelisa Ndima and Danal Visser. And I think I will end there, if that's okay. I'm not sure how much time I have left, but I'm happy to continue the conversation by question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Lauren. This was a kind of eye-opener, I'm sure, for many of us who are attending the symposium, listening to you, because we tend to look at maybe look at African literature and only the texts that are repeatedly spoken about over and over again. And you brought in such a very kind of new perspective, and you brought in new locations, and you brought in the very important idea of trauma, the spirit of human resilience. And I think in today's context, especially when we are discussing a lot about genocide and its implications on the victims of violence, the kind of range of African authors who have focused on trauma, whether it is historical trauma from the violence of colonial conquest, you mentioned Achebe, you mentioned Soyinka, whether it is the writers who have kind of opened our eyes to the genocide of the Tutsi in Rwanda, or the post-apartheid conditions in South Africa. And you also touched upon Namibia, and I am sure that many here would agree with me that Namibia is one location that we are not really that familiar with. And I'm sure this has, I'm sure your talk would have excited many of the younger listeners to kind of seek out the texts that you have mentioned. And as Ms. Amrita mentioned at the beginning, the scope for comparative perspectives. I'm sure that there may be questions from the students, but if you permit me, just a question. I was
Of
just
course.
wondering about the gendered perspective.
Mhm.
Is there any kind of a particular gendered perspective that that struck you when you did your analysis of these texts?
Sure. I mean, thank you for that question and for the opportunity to call more attention to that, and to you for calling attention to that. Certainly, you know, there is, if I were to think about the Rwandan example, and the kind of popular trend in many of the representations of the genocide that unfolded there is, I think, a tendency to gender these categories of perpetrator and victim, which are also, you know, often, I think, perhaps too easily ethnicized as well, where often narratives will, you know, have a perpetrator figure be specifically Hutu, and then more often than not, male. And victims are more often than not are represented as women, as female. But we know from the historical accounts that there were female perpetrators, but there were also many women who actively helped to resist and to participate in, you know, the kind of very physical demands of stopping that violence. So the representations, I think, you know, deserve some scrutiny, for lack of a better term, but of course this kind of critical literary eye that asks, you know, hang on, what's going on here? Are we too easily deciding to gender, you know, what it means or who gets framed in these terms?
Thank you. Thank you so much. If there are any questions, maybe you could unmute yourself, or you could put it into the chat box. I think we have time just for one question since the next speaker has joined. Okay, so thank you, Dr. Lauren. As I
Thank you.
mentioned in my email to you, this is kind of introductory symposium for the students. So I'm sure they will have a lot of questions as they start off with their reading, and we look forward to having you with us again, maybe sometime if
That
we
would
do
be
a
lovely.
follow-up
Thank
to
you
this
again.
symposium. Yeah. So
Absolutely.
thank you
Thank you
very
so much.
I
Thank
would
you.
now,
Enjoy the rest of the symposium, everyone. Sorry.
thank you. First,
Bye.
Rima, Rima,
Yes,
yeah, so if you can
yes,
please take over. I think Dr. Maya has joined.
yes, thank you. I'm excited to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Maya Devi Chalasheri. Dr. Maya is an assistant professor in the PG Department of English and Research Center at Vimala College, Thrissur, Kerala. She earned her PhD in English from the University of Calicut in 2025, where she had earlier topped both her MA and BA programs. She's a recipient of multiple accolades, including the Reliance Foundation Best Teacher Award in 2018 and top global rankings in the International Teachers Olympiad 2023. Dr. Chalasheri has over a decade of teaching experience at the undergraduate and postgraduate levels. Her academic contributions include 15 publications in reputable journals, conference proceedings, and edited volumes, as well as 20 paper presentations at national and international forums. She has been invited as a resource person, judge, and session chair for over 20 programs across prestigious institutions. She is actively engaged in curriculum development, faculty enrichment, and mentorship. She also has coordinated initiatives under Trinity College London, Cambridge BEC, UNAI, and government sponsored programs. We're very happy you're with us today, Dr. Maya.
Pleasure's mine, pleasure's mine.
Over to you.
Thank you so much. A very good evening to one and all. It is a privilege to be able to contribute to such an enriching symposium. I was absolutely attracted and absolutely fascinated by Dr. Lauren's presentation. Now, my title is From Griots to Global Voices, an Introduction to African Literature. Before I jump into my session, I'd like to ask the participants whether they like stories. If the organizers don't mind, I would like the participants to unmute yourself or probably type in chat messages and let me know if you like stories and if you were in the habit of listening to stories. Who are the people who told you these stories and why is it that you kept going back to them? Very quickly. Yeah, I can see chat messages coming. Yes.
Students, please free to either put it into the chat box or unmute yourself. I can see that Dr. Maya wants this to be an interactive session, so
Yes, yes.
okay. So please feel free, either the chat box or unmute yourselves.
Okay, I can see yeses coming up in the chat boxes. Now, I'll just quickly take you down. Yeah, I can see yeses. I can talk about, being young children and going to either your parents or your friends or siblings or grandparents if you had the privilege of living in joint families and listening to what they had to tell you. And they would tell you about animals and they would tell you about heroes and heroines and leaders and kings and queens. And they would tell you about lands and countries and geographies that you knew nothing about. And you would listen to all these stories and those stories stuck. Yes, rather than all the things that you have learned, you have come across so many chapters, so many lessons, so many theories throughout your life. And yet, if I ask you to relate that one story that you heard when you were a child, it'll come back to you. Yes, and in so many instances, it might have happened where you remember events in history because it was related to you by a history teacher who was very good with storytelling. So the power of stories is something I'd like to highlight in this session because African literature began long before the printed page. It begins with the voice. When we hear the phrase African literature, we might think of celebrated novels like Achebe's Things Fall Apart or powerful plays by Walt Schoenker. And for centuries, African societies, however, preserved their histories, values, and philosophies through oral traditions. It is here that griots come into the scene. Now, what are these griots, or who are these griots? Griots are the storytellers, historians, custodians, advisors. They are probably the memory keepers in West Africa, particularly, who could recite entire lineages stretching back hundreds of years. Now, you have proverbs that are integrated into the history that they spoke about, and they did not merely relate stories, mind you. They related entire episodes of lives that had been lived by ancestors. They took forward the ancient history. They preserved the past. And they are testimony to how storytelling is not merely entertainment, but a way of asserting perspective and power. These oral forms, epics, praise songs, and folk tales, are the roots from which written African literature would later grow. The arrival of colonial powers in the 19th and 20th centuries disturbed these traditions, but also sparked a literary awakening. Writers such as Achebe, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Amata Aidu began to write back to the empire, challenging stereotypes and reclaiming African identities. They showed the world that African societies were not voiceless or cultureless before colonialism. They had their own systems of governance, belief, and art. And it is here that there began a transition from oral tradition into written literature. And as we move into the late 20th and 21st centuries, African literature has become very, very boldly global. And you have authors like Adichie, Dangarembga, and other writers who have put African stories into conversations, and they've narrated stories, and they've taken these oral traditions, and they have also contributed towards cementing these oral traditions and converting them into the written word. And these conversations, these narratives take you through migration, feminism, climate justice, and what is being called Afrofuturism. So in exploring African literature, we are not just reading texts, we are entering into conversations about identity, resistance, tradition, and change. We are witnessing a literature that bridges ancient oral wisdom with contemporary global realities. So when I speak about a journey from griots to global voices, I invite you to listen carefully, to reflect deeply, and to question intensely and make connections between these works and the world that you live in. African literature is not a distant or exotic field. It speaks urgently to our shared human experience. Although the phrase African literature might make the entire art, the entire oeuvre of African literature seem to be very distant, unfamiliar, different from the literature that we are exposed to in our native lands, that might not be the case, is the point of this session. So we begin with the beginning, the griot tradition. So the griot tradition is one of the most important pillars of African oral literature, particularly in West Africa. And in some of the tribes, especially among the Mande people, you have a different category called the Jeli or the Jali. And these griots are far more than storytellers. They are historians, genealogists, poets, musicians, diplomats, and cultural custodians, preserving the memory of communities across generations. Now, when I talk to you about griot, I would also like to bring in my own experience. For instance, there are legends and myths that all of us have heard. I would like to share something very local. That is the region that I live in Kerala. It is called Arimbur. Now, there's a lot of history that you hear, history that you read in newspapers, history that you read in magazines, history that is, broadcast on audiovisual media during days of historical importance. But one of the stories that have stuck, one of the legends that it just stays in my mind is when there were elders in the family and they were sitting and discussing about how the region is called Arimbur. The place that I live is called Arimbur. And apparently, long years ago, in the olden times, it was referred to as Aripuram. Now, this is a very agrarian society. All the people in this region in the olden times, they were farmers, and the place is surrounded by paddy fields where you grow the grain rice. Ari is rice in my native language, and this region was called Aripuram. So we all thought, we children, we had an understanding it was called Aripuram, probably because there are a lot of paddy fields. But it is only when these elders got together and they started remembering the past and they started sharing stories that we realized that there is a story behind it. Apparently, in the ancient times, the gods were very happy with the region that I live in today because people were generally very joyful and very prosperous. And the gods decided that they would bless the lands, and instead of the grain, the cereal grain, which later becomes the rice after a lot of processing, instead of that grain, it is rice that grew in the fields. Now, the grain is called nelu and the rice is called ari. So instead of the, the cereal grain that would need a lot of processing, it was straight rice that grew in the paddy fields, because of which this region came to be called Aripuram, is the legend. So much of history that we've read in books, so much of history that we've heard. But this story, because it was related by these elders who were very proud of their land and who hold on to these stories, it just stuck. And whatever lessons we forget, somehow the generation of youngsters who sat that evening during the family function and listened to our elders, we hold these stories very close to our hearts. And griots are actually way more than these elders. They are people with very strong sense of responsibility and accountability, because they have to be very meticulous in the facts that they present. Thousands of years back, griots were the storytellers and come musicians who used to be directly present before the king in courts. And they would relate stories of ancestors that the king and the people should remember and act accordingly. They would relate the past that would shape their destinies. And they had to do so very, very meticulously, because no fault, no error should creep into the relating of history. And therein comes audience engagement. Audience could question them. Audience could add information. Audience should bear the responsibility of seeing to it that the griot is relating true facts. And like I said, this dates back to thousands of years, and griots belonged to specific families or lineages entrusted with the responsibility of keeping history alive. Their knowledge included royal genealogies, epic histories, codes of ethics, and cultural values. So what are the functions that they fulfilled? Historical preservation, entertainment and moral education, advisory and mediation, and cultural identity. These were the functions that they fulfilled. They were not mere storytellers. They were there with a purpose, and they were there as perfect custodians of cultural and historical identity. Now, the griots also used instruments like the kora, which is a stringed instrument, and drums to accompany their performance. And their performances were interactive, which brings in the fact that storytelling became a communal act. It was not a person of authority relating what that person knows. It was a communal act. And a famous example is the Epic of Sondayata, which tells the story of Sondayata, the founder of the Mali Empire. And today, the griot tradition continues both in rural villages and urban settings. There are contemporary musicians who draw on griot heritage, blending ancient forms with modern music. The griot ethos also influence African literature and cinema, where writers adopt the griot's role to give voice to history and identity. And the griot tradition demonstrates that African societies have always had sophisticated systems for preserving knowledge and culture. Now, this is where griot tradition gains greater significance, because it stands as a testimony to the fact that literature, culture, and history of the African continent is as rich and meritorious as the history of any other country. For long years, African literature was not something that was taken up in its entirety. In fact, not many people knew about African literature. It was not as popular. Theories that were coming up during the previous times were very, very Eurocentric. You have the rise of colonialism, wherein African literature was relegated to the background. But the griot tradition brings out the fact that African literature is as rich and as probably fulfilling for any scholar, any leader, any reader, any literature enthusiast as any other literature and culture of a country. It challenges the misconception that Africa's past is silent or lost. Instead, it shows that memory, performance, and storytelling are powerful tools for continuity and resistance. Now, how is griot tradition? Griot tradition is something that oral tradition is something that started becoming transformed, especially after the colonial era when African writers started writing. And then you also have discussions about which language should African writings be written in. Which brings us to questions about the fact that a lot of African writing is about resistance, a lot of it is about preserving their history, a lot of it is a question, it's a challenge to the powers that established authority over their lands and their people. And the question that the African writers faced was, what language should we retaliate in? What language should we challenge the authority in? Should we challenge it using the language that they speak, or should we challenge it using the language that is our native tongue to assert our power and our authority? So before going over to how the griot tradition slowly transformed into a global voice, I'd like to bring a little bit of interesting aspect to prove my point. I came across proverbs that are integrated into African literature, and I'll read some of these proverbs, and I request the participants to let me know if these proverbs make sense to you, because these proverbs are African. I'll read them to you in English, but these are African. Obviously, they are connected and related to African identities and African culture, and to a large group of people who think that African literature is different or distant. I would like to bring, I'm just using the example of these proverbs to show you how African literature can easily be integrated into the literary and cultural understanding of one's own native arts and native literature. Okay, so these are some of the proverbs. Do not set out on a journey using someone else's donkey. Look for a black goat while it is still daytime. Do not beat a drum with an axe. Beware of the naked man who sells or offers you clothes. A person who sells eggs must not start a fight in the market. The eyes do not carry the load, but they know what the head can carry. The lizard had the tree in mind before challenging the dog to a fight. The hands that make mistakes belong to those who work. If you are bitten by a snake, you fear seeing a rope at night. These are some of the proverbs. Do they make sense to you? Are you able to understand the essence of the proverbs? I can see one yes in the chat box. Yeah, more yeses coming in. Yes, you can understand these proverbs. They make sense to you. You all agree that they bear wisdom. So it is here that African literature becomes a very important movement or force in, you could say, in the global academic, literary, and art community. Because African literature deals with what you and I are concerned with what you and I feel, with what you and I harbor and hold within ourselves. Yes, and I'm very sure, because this is an online session, I don't think interaction is very smooth or easy. But if it were an offline session, I'm very sure you would also be surprised, some of you at least, if you paid attention to the proverbs, that some of these proverbs have their own versions in our native tongue. I don't know if any, I don't know what all are your native tongues. But when I read through the proverbs just to see if I could give you some activity, I was very, very surprised to see that some of the proverbs actually have their own counterparts in my native language. And my native language is Malayalam. And these proverbs are mostly in African languages. But like if I am to quote an example, this one, if you are bitten by a snake, you fear seeing a rope at night. We have a proverb in Malayalam which says, "Chuduvellathil veena poocha, pachavellam kanda bhayakkum," meaning a cat that has fallen into hot water will get frightened of normal water. More or less the same, the sense, yes? So then we come to how African literature did not begin in the 19th and 20th centuries. It has always thrived through oral and written forms. What changed was global recognition. As colonial barriers weakened and African writers used accessible accessible languages and formats to reclaim their stories and reach worldwide audiences. There are several interconnected reasons why African literature remained largely unknown for a few centuries back, and some of these are the fact that some of the reasons include the fact that oral traditions were undervalued. African societies preserved history, like I told you, through oral storytelling, praise poetry, and proverbs rather than written texts. Also, there is a very clear Eurocentric bias. European scholars often dismissed oral traditions as primitive or non-literary. This means that even though rich literary traditions existed, they were not documented or scholarly approached outside of Africa. Colonial and cultural suppression. European colonial powers imposed their languages, education systems, and cultural values. Indigenous texts in African languages were often ignored or deliberately suppressed. Colonial narratives portrayed Africa as a blank state sometimes, or a dark continent. Dark not only referring to the color, but dark also referring to the fact that a lot of literature was ignored or rested in ignorance. Okay, to justify imperialism, erasing or marginalizing local voices. Limited access to global publishing and literacy. Before and during colonial rule, publishing infrastructure on the continent was minimal, and most African authors had little access to printing presses. Literacy in European languages was restricted to a small elite, and indigenous scripts or texts rarely reached global markets. So these are some of the reasons why there was why African literature probably took some time to come out and establish its place within the larger academic context of the world as we know it today. And then, of course, emergence of Western written African literature in colonial languages. It was only in the mid-20th century that writers like Achebe, Thiongo, Soyinka, and Tutuola began publishing in English or French, using familiar forms like the novel and the play. These works made African voices legible to Western audiences and began dismantling stereotypes. Again, post-colonial scholarship and globalization also changed, these movements changed the perception of African literature. So this brings us to the entire, what can I say, treasure trove of African literature as we know it today. So what are some of the works, seminal works? These will be discussed in detail and in plenty by resource persons during the symposium, and it would be a repetition if I do the same, but still, Things Fall Apart by Achebe, and the novel portrays the life of Okonkwo in the Igbo society before and during colonial intrusion. Now, Achebe uses native words, proverbs, and oral forms to resist colonial representations. Now, what are the contemporary connections that we can draw? Cultural identity and resistance. In our era of globalization, migration, and diasporas, questions like what is authentic identity, or how do communities negotiate cultural loss or assimilation? These are very, very lively discussions. And the tension that Achebe illustrates between maintaining tradition and adapting to external pressures is mirrored in many parts of the world. So herein, in this part of the session, what I'm trying to emphasize is the fact that African literature need not be seen as particularly African literature itself. You could easily read African literature as being narratives of what we see in our contemporary society and in our immediate community even. So post-colonial borders and conflict, the arbitrary borders drawn by colonial powers created states with multiple ethnic, linguistic, and religious groups forced together. Today, many conflicts, not only in Africa but elsewhere, reflect these artificial divisions and misunderstandings across cultural lines. What else? Masculinity and gender roles. Here now, the ideas of masculinity mentioned in the book, the fear of the protagonist of weakness and often violent suppression of emotions resonate with current debates about masculinity, including toxic masculinity, gender norms, and mental health all over the world. Another book that I've chosen is Half of a Yellow Sun by Adichie. The novel is set during a war in Nigeria, exploring ethnic conflict, political betrayal, war's human cost, class and race, loyalty and identity. It also shows how colonial legacies like boundaries, borders, political systems, ethnic tensions feed into post-colonial instability. So what are the contemporary links that you can draw? Ethnic and sectarian conflict. Many countries continue to struggle with ethnic polarization, nationalism, or sectarian violence. The writer's depiction of how political manipulation, fear, and historical grievances can lead to mass suffering remains unfortunately very, very relevant. Refugees, displacement, and humanitarian crises. The displacement and suffering caused by civil war has been portrayed in this novel, and it parallels modern refugee crisis. You take the Syrian refugee crisis, you take Rohingya, you take the Sudan. Civilians are caught between warring forces, and this book throws open the stark reality before the readers. Memory and reconciliation, how societies remember past atrocities, how they heal, and how they try to prevent future conflict. The novel models the importance of facing the past rather than suppressing it. Again, this is a very, very African ideology wherein you look to the past as you move into the future. In fact, there is a symbol of a bird that is upheld by certain parts and certain communities in Africa. I forget the name of that logo, that symbol, wherein a bird is shown to be flying forward with its head turned backward, referring to the fact that you look into the past to move into the future as a better informed, better aware, and powerful element in the entire, in the entire reality, or in the entire history, or in the entire past, present, and future of a community. Next, you have a story of a young Shona girl in colonial Rhodesia, her struggle involving gender inequality. The book is called Nervous Conditions, Gender Inequality, Colonial Education, Race, Identity, and the Psychological Cost of it. Particularly strong is the critique of how colonial culture and patriarchal expectations shape and often limit the lives of women. So herein you have the context of, the feminism and gender coming in. And again, what are the contemporary links that you can draw? Access to education, gender equity, mental health and identity under cultural pressure. The novel explores how exposure to conflicting cultural norms can cause psychological strain. Again, conflicting cultural norms. You have a lot of books that are coming up now that refer to how children, in the African countries, they dream of moving away, and then they end up going or migrating to other countries. And then there is a cultural clash, cultural conflict, and a conflict of identity. I think one novel would be We Need New Names. I believe that's the name of the novel, We Need New Names. A group of preteens who live in Zimbabwe, but they move to US and the kind of conflict that they face. Again, intersectionality, the way race, gender, class, and colonial history intersect, is a model for understanding inequality today. Decolonizing the Mind by Ngugi wa Thiong'o, which is a nonfiction set of essays arguing that language is central to culture, identity, and power. Again, Ngugi wa Thiong'o's theory, or the points, the statements, the political stand that the writer has taken, you can adopt that into studying literatures from various other countries in the world. Covering topics like language politics and education, debates over medium of instruction, very, very relevant even in our community, in schools, universities, and how that affects identity, learning, and inclusion. Again, digital culture and linguistic diversity in social media, literature, music. Many African writers are reclaiming indigenous languages or hybrid forms to resist standardization or global English norms. Intellectual independence, the idea that knowledge systems built in colonial contexts still influence what is taught, what is valued, and who gets heard. This is relevant in higher education and global knowledge networks. Now, putting together what we have seen. Now, these are just very few examples of African literature, very, very few examples. Now, why do these works matter? Because they bridge the past, and the present. They bridge a culture that is at the first glance unfamiliar to us, that might be different from ours, but they bridge it with the kind of life that we're living, with the kind of culture that we uphold. Now, here is what they tell us about contemporary global issues. The fact that identity is contested. That's one. In a world shaped by migration, displacement, diaspora, it shows us that identity is not fixed. It is historical, political, often contested. Second, power of memory and history. Forgetting or misrepresenting history has real social and political consequences. And here, the griots, the position role that they have. You have modern day griots who have come across, you find them on social media, you find them across platforms. And these griots, this is my observation, I believe that they are masters and servants. They're masters because they relate what is true. They relate history. They carry forward the stories of yore. They carry forward the stories of yesterday. But they're also servants because they are held responsible and accountable for every tale that they relate, for every episode in history that they share with their audience. And therefore, like I told you, this is my observation, they are both masters and servants. Another issue, another global topic that comes into play in a lot of African literatures, again, gender and social justice, how gender inequality intersects with colonial legacies, education, and culture. Another point is the relationship between the local and the global. The African texts, they show how local cultures, languages, and histories are not parochial. They connect to global challenges like conflict, migration, climate, fantasy fiction even, racial discussions, etc. They also remind us that solutions often need to start from the local context. I believe there is a proverb that speaks the same. I don't. The ruin of a
Dr.
nation
Maya?
begins. Yes. Is my time up?
Dr. Maya, around
Yes.
5 minutes.
Oh, sure. I'm winding up. The ruin of a nation begins in the homes of its people. And when the roots of a tree, no, the child who is not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth. These seem to be everyday proverbs that relate to you and me, and they seem to be very particular proverbs, but it rings true even in world politics, right? And yeah, and this is my concluding, as we navigate the 21st century with its pandemics, forced migrations, climate crises, social reckonings, identity politics, these works of African literature remain vital. They're not just relics of colonial or post-colonial times. They're not mere they're not mere recounting of the past. They are not only the artifacts that uphold the rich tradition and heritage that African literature have, they are lenses through which we can reflect on our own world. So next time when you read a book that belongs to African literature, don't just see them as windows into Africa's past. See them as mirrors, reflecting issues of identity, power, justice that may be shaping your own life, your own community. Literature is not just about stories of otherness that brings to you worlds that are unfamiliar. It is about our shared humanity. And to conclude my session, I'd like to share a little poem that I've written. And it goes thus. Our literature, that is our native literature, talks about culture. It shapes identity, perspectives, understanding. It reflects the life and times of people, places. It records history and becomes the testimony of generations. Why then must we read, know, learn, contemplate on other literatures? While we cannot peruse or partake completely of the infinite art that is available to us, we read because books open up worlds of wonder. We read to discover new people, new races, new societies. We read and converge over lunches and dinner dates and academic forums, arguing, debating, and excitedly sharing the various layers we uncover across languages, ethnicities, regions, and beliefs. And while exploring, we come across the same breath that keeps us alive, the same blood that cruises our veins, the same joy, sorrows, and desires that keep us awake, and we realize why then must literature across lands and seas be read. For they bind us, the human race, together with an invisible twine of all things universal, beautiful, and true. So on that note, I think I'll just stop. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful session, Dr. Maya. I really loved how you made it interactive and you drew us into the story of African literature, the way you spoke about griots as memory keepers, holding centuries of history in their voices was so moving. And it made me reflect on how storytelling truly does connect us all. It's an invisible thread that's connected all of us. And what especially struck me was your reminder that in African thought, we look to the past when we think of the future, we look to the future. That makes African literature not only timeless, but also deeply relevant to how we live and how we imagine tomorrow. And
Very true.
so I'm very grateful for the way you brought that to life for us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
I this is might be a silly question, but since we were talking about how since African literature begins with the voice, do you see or in the future do you see oral traditions and digital platforms now they working together to carry these like stories forward into the future? Because how are these oral traditions going to last in this digital world, right?
Yes. Your question is whether the oral tradition will be upheld?
Yes.
Very much, very much. In fact, if it were a longer session, I would have loved to share some videos with the participants wherein you have these griots performing live on stage for audiences, them coming up and, earlier, if griots were limited because of spatial and temporal concerns to particular communities and regions of Africa, today they can sit within the confines of their homes, within their communities, and they can communicate with the farthest of places. And I think digital platforms would only contribute exponentially to the growth of such oral traditions. And this is something that I always believe and this is something that I tell students, as long as the human race exists in this world, storytelling will not
Yeah.
go out of fashion. It will forever be one of those things that bind us together, because storytelling at all levels, a young baby who's born sitting in the lap of the mother, a young child who's growing and listening to his father and his elders, older siblings relating stories, even silly ones, made up stories that you tell. Storytelling is something that pulls out to your heart. Not many people might be inclined towards reading, not many people might be film buffs, but I don't think there is anybody who doesn't like a good story in some form or the other. And anything that is to be related to people, if put in the form of a story, is generally stays with them. For instance, I can probably tell you that I walked to the bus stop this morning and I saw a ferocious dog, and I was frightened, and I hoped that it wouldn't notice me. I can tell it to you like this, or I can say, I walked to the bus stop in the morning, but I saw a ferocious stray dog, and I kept quiet as much as possible, hoping that I will not be noticed. So you see, when you bring in elements of storytelling, everything, even such a mundane thing as seeing a stray dog on the street, becomes very interesting. So I think when you talk about something as legendary, as intense, and as deep as the griot tradition, it will definitely be kept alive. I do also have at least 3 or 4 TEDx videos that are very, very interesting, very informative about the griot tradition. I also I saw the interview of a griot artist and how fluently they speak about their art, their craft, and how willingly they present themselves to the world, and how humbly proud they are about the richness of their culture. I think all of these draws to this, the African literature. That's it.
I'd love for you to share with us those videos, ma'am. We'd love to watch them.
I'll definitely share it right now, or should I
Yeah,
put
yeah.
the?
Later is fine. I can share
Yeah,
it with the participants also.
yeah.
Yes.
I'll send it over to you then.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I'll now hand over to Dr. Rashmi Lee George for the closing remarks.
Sure.
Thank you so much, Rima. And thank you, Dr. Maya, for this wonderful exposition on oral storytelling. I just like to, while I make these closing remarks, just maybe summarize very briefly the points that were made, or at least the points that I managed to register. So we started with Amrita Shenoy, a member of our department. And what was common to at least three of the speakers was we started with the map of the African continent, and Amrita also shared that the beginning, putting the geography of Africa right in front of us. She also challenged the reductive interpretations of Africa, discussed points of African alterity, the geographical dissonance caused by the political movements in Africa, and also the compulsive exile that many of the writers had to go into. Amrita also stressed on the importance of English and also the local languages that seeped into African writings. We also heard from Dr. Mala the writings that emerged from Africa, and also about the political writings from the African continent. And those writings were mainly to reclaim one's denied identity. Ma'am also stressed upon Frantz Fanon's remark of control through a series of ideological mechanisms. She also touched upon the negritude movement led by Aimé Césaire, Leopold Senghor, and many others. Ma'am also started with the first generation writers, transition to the 1970s, talked about a writer as recent as Chimamanda Adichie. And I think ma'am also stressed on the contribution of the growth of post-colonial writing through Chinua Achebe, who's been talked about by almost every other speaker today. Things Fall Apart becoming a foundational moment of literary history, and how he reclaims the Igbo culture through that book. Ngugi wa Thiong'o's seminal book, Decolonizing the Mind, and his other novels, and also especially the fact that he chose to write in his local language, Kikuyu. We also heard about Arma's representation of disillusionment and the beautiful ones beautiful ones are not yet born, which was also a novel that many students in Xavier's studied. We also heard about the 1970s, the transition of anti-government writings, the petrofiction of Ken Saro-Wiwa, and also the fact that he had the ability to take literature into the streets and streets into literature. We also heard about Nuruddin Farah, the Somalian writer's Maps, his novel Maps, Gifts, which in the context of, Gifts particularly, which speaks about the context of international aid, and also the politics of giving and receiving, the micronationalism and ethnographic violence. Ma'am spoke about Jack Mapanje's writings from prison, also his activism, which cost his legs. And this is a story ma'am has shared in the past as well. I remember listening to ma'am about this. Also about the geographical dissonance, something that Amrita also touched upon in their dissident writings. Thus, we were given an overview of African literature, mainly the male writers, because tomorrow we will hear about the women writers from Africa and their activism to the point of losing their lives. For example, in the case of Ken Saro-Wiwa. From Dr. Lorraine, we heard, I found a statement very interesting. You can't jam African literature in one neat definition. Colonialism itself is a kind of genocide by Frantz Fanon. Dr. Lorraine focused on trauma narratives that problematize colonial impacts and colonial ideologies. She also highlighted the spirit of human resilience, and also the idea of Ubuntu, something that we have also heard in India a lot, Ubuntu from the African continent. What I found most interesting about her talks was that she touched upon writers that really I have not read, and also spaces that we really don't focus on so much in India. So, for example, Hama Tuma's work, which shows the state in which direct colonialism, although Ethiopia was not directly colonized, it impacted Ethiopia because of various ideological colonial structures. She also spoke about the Rwandan genocide that was reflected in literatures. And while the genocide was a reality, the resilience of the people was also another reality that we were told about. We heard about the South African apartheid and post-apartheid writings, and the Namibian genocidal narratives as well. With Dr. Maya Devi, we also heard about the power of storytelling, the role that the griots play as memory keepers, and also the importance of the griot tradition in the oral storytelling. For example, them being hereditary oral historians, and how they transmit community histories, genealogies, and cultural knowledge through their oral narratives, and how these African societies have preserved their stories through oral traditions. So Dr. Maya also showed the impact of this tradition on various writers, including Chinua Achebe. They in fact related entire episodes of the past. We heard various proverbs from her, and these traditions impacted the writers who wrote back to the empire. So all in all, we had a treat from all these speakers, and it was such a joy to listen to scholars on African writing, because believe me, it's not something that we hear frequently. And I think it is not enough to stress upon this idea that this needs to be done frequently. This needs to be talked about frequently. So thank you all the speakers this conference. Just a little reminder about tomorrow. We will start around 10:30. Actually, 10:30 is the breakfast outside the multimedia room on the first floor in St. Xavier's College. And at 11 o'clock, we start our session. So all of you are welcome, and to be part of it. We have a series of speakers, and I'm sure the schedule might have been shared with you. So if there's anything, you can always write to us and ask us about it. I don't know, ma'am, is there anything else that needs to be announced, or anyone, if there's something else that... Also the feedback form, I'm sorry, I almost forgot about it. The feedback form has to be filled so that we can send you your certificates. So please fill up the feedback form. Without that, the certificates will not be available. So I don't know, is there anything else? If
No, ma'am, I think
Gotten logged out again.
oh, okay,
She
okay.
sent a text, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, is that all? Is there anything else? Rima or
Yeah.
Prashita?
we've informed everything.
Okay. All right. Thank you all. See you
you.
tomorrow.
See you.
See you, bye-bye.
Bye.